Marcus Thompson sat on the cold concrete steps of the unemployment office, his worn military jacket providing little warmth against the harsh winter wind. The jacket, once a symbol of pride and honor, now bore faded patches and frayed edges that told the story of a man forgotten by the system he had served. 3 years had passed since Marcus returned from his final deployment in Afghanistan. 3 years of struggling to find steady work. 3 years of watching his savings disappear. And 3 years of feeling invisible in a world that had moved on without him. The transition from military life to civilian life had been far more brutal than any battlefield he had faced. Marcus had served 15 years in the Army, specializing in military intelligence and communications. He had earned numerous commendations for his service, including 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, from an IED explosion that left him with a permanent limp. But none of these achievements seemed to matter in the civilian job market. Employers would thank him for his service with empty smiles, then cite concerns about his ability to adapt to corporate culture. His apartment had been lost 6 months ago when he could no longer afford the rent. Since then, Marcus had been staying at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, paying week by week with what little money he could scrape together from odd jobs. The motel was a far cry from the barracks he once called home. But it was shelter, and for now that had to be enough. The unemployment office had become a second home of sorts. Marcus knew every counselor by name, had filled out countless applications, and had attended every job fair they recommended. Today was no different. He clutched a folder containing his resume, references, and discharge papers, hoping against hope that something would finally break his way. As he stood up to enter the building, Marcus caught his reflection in the glass door. The man staring back at him looked older than his 38 years. Gray streaks had appeared in his dark hair and worry lines creased his face, but his posture remained straight, a habit ingrained by years of military discipline that no amount of hardship could break. Inside the building, the familiar smell of coffee and bureaucracy filled his nostrils. The waiting area was crowded with other job seekers, each carrying their own stories of struggle and disappointment. Marcus took a number and found an empty chair, settling in for what he knew would be a long wait. His mind wandered to his military days, when purpose and direction had been clear. He remembered the camaraderie of his unit, the satisfaction of completing difficult missions, and the pride he felt wearing his uniform. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, a different person living a different life. The overhead speaker crackled to life, calling his number. Marcus made his way to the designated window, where a tired-looking woman in her 50s greeted him with a weary smile. She had helped him before, and he could see the sympathy in her eyes as she pulled up his file on her computer. She explained that there were few new opportunities since his last visit, mostly minimum wage positions that would barely cover his motel expenses. Marcus listened politely, though he had heard similar conversations dozens of times before. He knew she was trying to help, but the system seemed designed to keep people like him trapped in an endless cycle of rejection and disappointment. As he prepared to leave the office, Marcus overheard a conversation between 2 men near the exit. One was complaining loudly about the quality of job applicants, claiming that veterans were unreliable and difficult to manage. The other man nodded in agreement, adding that military experience was often irrelevant in the modern workplace. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. He had learned to swallow his pride, to accept the indignities that came with his current situation. Speaking up would only make things worse, and he could not afford to burn any bridges, no matter how small they might be. Walking back to his motel, Marcus passed a recruitment center where young men and women were lined up to begin their military careers. He remembered being their age, full of hope and determination, believing that his service would mean something beyond the battlefield. The irony was not lost on him that the very institution that had shaped him into the man he was today had also left him unprepared for the world he now inhabited. That evening, Marcus sat on his motel bed staring at the classified ads in the local newspaper. Circle after circle marked potential opportunities, but he knew from experience that most would lead nowhere. His phone battery was nearly dead, and he could not afford to replace it if it stopped working entirely. Communication with potential employers had become increasingly difficult as his resources dwindled. The walls of the motel room seemed to close in around him as he contemplated his situation. He had hit rock bottom before during his darkest moments overseas, but this felt different. At least in combat, he had his brothers in arms beside him. Now he faced his battles alone, armed only with memories of better days and a determination that grew weaker with each passing rejection. As night fell over the city, Marcus lay down on the uncomfortable mattress, still wearing his clothes in case he needed to leave quickly. Tomorrow would bring another day of searching, another day of hoping, and quite possibly another day of disappointment. But he would face it as he had faced everything else in his life, with whatever strength he had left and the knowledge that surrender was not an option. The call came on a Tuesday morning when Marcus had almost given up hope. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah Chen, a human resources manager at Henderson Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that produced parts for military vehicles. She had seen his resume and wanted to schedule an interview for a logistics coordinator position. Marcus felt a surge of excitement that he quickly tempered with caution. He had been through this process many times before, only to face rejection at the final stage. Still, Henderson Manufacturing seemed different. Their work with military contracts suggested they might actually value his experience rather than see it as a liability. He used his last few dollars to get his only dress shirt cleaned and pressed. The shirt had seen better days, with a small stain near the collar that he hoped would not be too noticeable. His dress shoes had been resoled twice, but they were still presentable. Marcus understood the importance of first impressions, and he was determined to make the best one possible despite his limited resources. The Henderson Manufacturing building was located in an industrial district about an hour's bus ride from his motel. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, a habit from his military days that had never left him. He sat in the lobby, observing the employees who passed by. They seemed professional but relaxed, and several wore clothing that suggested they worked directly with machinery and equipment. Sarah Chen appeared at the appointed time, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She led Marcus through a tour of the facility, explaining how they manufactured components for armored vehicles and communication systems. As they walked past the production floor, Marcus felt a familiar sense of purpose stirring within him. This was work that mattered, work that supported the men and women still serving overseas. The interview began in a small conference room with Sarah and two other managers. Marcus answered their questions about logistics, supply chain management, and quality control with confidence born from real experience. He spoke about coordinating supply drops in hostile territory, managing equipment inventories under extreme pressure, and ensuring that critical supplies reach their destinations despite numerous obstacles. For the first time in months, Marcus felt like himself again. The corporate jargon and buzzwords that had confused him in previous interviews were replaced by practical discussions about real problems that needed solving. He could see in their faces that they understood the value of his experience, that they recognized the skills he had developed during his years of service. The interview lasted over an hour, much longer than Marcus had expected. Sarah explained that they were looking for someone who could start immediately and grow with the company. The position offered health benefits, a decent salary, and the possibility of advancement based on performance. It sounded almost too good to be true. As the interview concluded, Sarah walked Marcus back to the lobby. She mentioned that they had several other candidates to interview, but that they hoped to make a decision within the week. Marcus thanked her for her time and the opportunity, maintaining his professional demeanor even as hope bloomed in his chest for the first time in months. The bus ride back to his motel gave Marcus time to replay every moment of the interview. He analyzed his responses, wondering if he had said too much or too little. The military had taught him to conduct thorough after-action reviews, and he applied that same discipline to civilian situations. Overall, he felt cautiously optimistic about his chances. That evening, Marcus allowed himself to imagine what life might look like with steady employment. He could afford a real apartment, maybe even save enough money to buy a car eventually. The simple prospect of not worrying about where his next meal would come from felt like an impossible luxury. He could rebuild his life piece by piece until he resembled the man he used to be. The waiting period stretched longer than Sarah had indicated. Days turned into a week, then 2 weeks without any communication from Henderson Manufacturing. Marcus called twice, leaving polite voicemails asking about the status of his application. Each day without news felt like a small defeat, but he tried to maintain hope while continuing his job search elsewhere. Other interviews came and went during this period, but none felt as promising as Henderson Manufacturing. Marcus began to question whether he had misread the situation, whether his optimism had clouded his judgment about how well the interview had actually gone. The doubt was familiar, a constant companion that had grown stronger with each rejection over the past 3 years. Finally, on a Friday afternoon, his phone rang. It was Sarah Chen, and Marcus could tell from her tone that the news was not what he wanted to hear. She explained that they had decided to go with another candidate, someone with more recent civilian logistics experience. She thanked him for his time and wished him luck in his job search. Marcus hung up the phone and sat in silence for several minutes. He had prepared himself for this possibility, but the disappointment still hit him like a physical blow. Henderson Manufacturing had seemed like his best chance in months, and now that door was closed like all the others before it. The rejection letter arrived 3 days later, a formal document that added insult to injury. It contained the standard language about keeping his resume on file for future opportunities, words that Marcus knew were meaningless. He folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others in a manila envelope that had grown thick with similar disappointments. That night, Marcus walked the streets around his motel, trying to clear his head and figure out his next move. His resources were running dangerously low, and the weekly motel payment was due again soon. The thought of becoming homeless terrified him more than any enemy he had faced overseas. At least in combat, he had training and equipment to rely on. Out here, he felt defenseless against forces he could not see or fight. The eviction notice appeared on Marcus's motel room door on a gray Thursday morning. The bright yellow paper fluttered in the wind like a flag of surrender, informing him that he had 24 hours to pay the outstanding balance or vacate the premises. He stared at the notice for a long moment, the words blurring as the reality of his situation finally hit him with full force. Marcus had been behind on his weekly payments for 3 weeks, surviving on the manager's reluctant patience and empty promises of employment. The manager, a gruff man named Eddie who had served in Vietnam, had given Marcus more chances than he probably should have. But even Eddie's sympathy had limits, and those limits had apparently been reached. Inside his room, Marcus surveyed his few remaining possessions. Everything he owned could fit into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box. His military medals sat in a small wooden case his father had made for him, the ribbons still bright despite the tarnished metal. His discharge papers, references, and certificates occupied a thin folder that represented 15 years of dedicated service, reduced to bureaucratic documentation. The irony was bitter and inescapable. Marcus had spent years protecting his country, ensuring the safety and security of his fellow citizens, only to find himself facing homelessness in the very nation he had sworn to defend. The disconnect between his past service and present circumstances felt like a cruel joke played by an indifferent universe. He walked to the motel office to speak with Eddie one more time. The older man looked up from his paperwork with tired eyes that held genuine regret. Eddie explained that he had bills to pay and a business to run, that keeping Marcus around without payment was simply impossible. He offered to hold Marcus's belongings for a week if he could find somewhere else to stay, a small kindness that Marcus accepted gratefully. With nowhere else to turn, Marcus made his way to the local veterans' shelter. The building was a converted warehouse that housed 30 men in cramped conditions that reminded him uncomfortably of a field hospital. The smell of unwashed bodies and disinfectant filled the air, creating an atmosphere of desperation that seemed to cling to everything. The intake process was humiliating but necessary. Marcus answered questions about his service record, his current circumstances, and his plans for finding permanent housing. The social worker, a young woman named Jennifer who seemed genuinely caring but overwhelmed by her caseload, explained the shelter's rules and limitations. He could stay for 30 days maximum, after which he would need to find alternative arrangements. That first night in the shelter was one of the longest of Marcus's life. The bunks were arranged military style, but the similarity to his service days only made the current situation more painful. Around him, other veterans struggled with their own demons, addiction, mental illness, and the same employment difficulties that had brought Marcus to this place. Their stories were variations on a common theme of service, sacrifice, and abandonment. Marcus lay awake listening to the sounds of restless sleep, coughing, and occasional nightmares. The man in the bunk next to him muttered in his sleep about incoming mortars, his body twitching as he relived battles that had ended years ago. It was a reminder that Marcus's problems, severe as they were, could always be worse. The shelter operated on a strict schedule designed to encourage residents to spend their days looking for work or housing. Everyone had to be out by 8 in the morning and could not return until 5 in the evening. This meant that Marcus spent his days wandering the city, visiting the library for internet access, and applying for jobs from public computers with slow connections and limited time restrictions. The job search had become even more challenging now that he lacked a permanent address. Many applications required a home address, and using the shelter's address often resulted in immediate rejection. Marcus learned to be creative with his contact information, using a friend's address from his Army days or the local Veterans Affairs office as a mailing address. Meals at the shelter were basic but filling. Donated food prepared by volunteers, who ranged from genuinely compassionate to merely fulfilling community service requirements. Marcus appreciated the nutrition but struggled with the charity aspect of his situation. He had always been self-reliant, taking care of his own needs and those of his fellow soldiers. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat, even though he knew it was necessary for survival. The other residents at the shelter represented a cross-section of military experience spanning several decades. There were Vietnam veterans who had been homeless for years, struggling with addiction and untreated PTSD. Gulf War veterans dealt with mysterious illnesses that the VA was slow to acknowledge or treat. Younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan faced many of the same employment challenges that Marcus confronted daily. Despite their different backgrounds, the men formed an informal support network based on shared experience and mutual understanding. They shared job leads, information about resources, and the kind of dark humor that military personnel used to cope with difficult situations. For Marcus, this camaraderie provided a lifeline during his darkest moments, reminding him that he was not alone in his struggles. As his 30-day limit at the shelter approached, Marcus felt the pressure mounting. He had received several interview requests but no job offers. Each rejection felt more devastating than the last, not just because of the lost opportunity, but because of the approaching deadline for finding alternative housing. The prospect of sleeping on the streets loomed larger each day, a possibility that seemed increasingly inevitable despite his best efforts. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult week when Marcus received 3 rejection letters in a single day. The last one was from a company where he had felt confident about his chances, a security firm that seemed perfectly suited to his background and experience. The form letter thanked him for his interest but stated that they had selected a candidate whose qualifications better matched their current needs. That evening, Marcus sat on a bench outside the shelter, staring at the city lights and wondering how his life had reached this point. He thought about his fellow soldiers who had died overseas, men and women who would never have the chance to face these civilian struggles. The survivor's guilt that he had carried since his discharge felt heavier than ever, mixed with anger at a system that seemed determined to discard those who had served it faithfully. The charity dinner was Marcus's last desperate attempt to find employment before his shelter stay expired. The event, hosted by a local business association, was billed as a networking opportunity for veterans and potential employers. Marcus had borrowed a clean shirt from another shelter resident and spent his last $2 on bus fare to attend. The hotel ballroom was filled with men and women in expensive suits, their conversations creating a buzz of prosperity that made Marcus feel even more out of place. He stood near the back of the room, nursing a glass of water and watching the interactions between veterans and business leaders. Most of the conversations seemed polite but superficial, the kind of networking that rarely led to actual opportunities. Near the front of the room, a small stage had been set up for speakers. The evening's program included remarks from several successful business owners and a retired military officer who now worked in the private sector. Marcus listened politely to their speeches about the value of military experience and the importance of supporting veterans, words that sounded hollow given his recent experiences. During the cocktail hour, Marcus noticed a commotion near the bar area. A tall man in an expensive suit was speaking loudly to a small group of listeners, his voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. As Marcus moved closer, he realized the man was telling war stories, but from the perspective of someone who had clearly never served. The man introduced himself as Colonel Richardson, though Marcus quickly realized he was using the title as a business nickname rather than a military rank. Richardson owned a successful defense contracting company and was regaling his audience with tales of his company's contributions to various military operations. His stories were filled with technical inaccuracies and misunderstandings that would have been obvious to anyone with actual combat experience. As Richardson continued his monologue, his tone became increasingly condescending toward actual veterans. He complained about the quality of former military personnel in the civilian workforce, claiming that most veterans lacked the adaptability and innovation required for modern business. According to Richardson, military training created followers rather than leaders, people who could only function within rigid hierarchical structures. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as Richardson's comments became more insulting. The man spoke about veterans as if they were damaged goods, people whose military experience had somehow made them unfit for productive civilian careers. He shared anecdotes about veteran employees who had supposedly failed at his company, painting them as inflexible and unable to think outside the box. The audience around Richardson seemed uncomfortable with his remarks, but no one challenged him directly. Marcus understood their reluctance. Richardson was clearly wealthy and influential, the kind of person who could make or break careers with a word. Still, the silence felt like complicity, another small betrayal of the men and women who had served their country with honor. Richardson's voice rose as he warmed to his subject, apparently emboldened by the lack of opposition. He began making jokes about broken soldiers and welfare warriors, terms that struck Marcus like physical blows. The man was essentially mocking everyone in the room who had worn a uniform, treating their service and sacrifice as subjects for crude humor. When Richardson made a particularly offensive comment about veterans with PTSD being weak-minded, Marcus felt something snap inside him. Years of frustration, rejection, and humiliation crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. He had remained silent too long, swallowed too many insults, accepted too much disrespect from people who had never risked anything for their country. Marcus stepped forward, his movement catching Richardson's attention. The businessman turned toward him with an expression of mild annoyance, as if he had been interrupted by someone beneath his notice. The conversations around them began to quiet as people sensed the tension building between the two men. Richardson looked Marcus up and down, taking in his worn clothing and obvious financial struggles. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth as he apparently decided that Marcus posed no threat to his authority or reputation. The condescension in his expression was unmistakable, the look of a man who believed that wealth and success gave him the right to look down on those less fortunate. The room had grown almost completely silent now, with dozens of eyes focused on the confrontation. Marcus could feel the weight of their attention, but also their curiosity about what would happen next. Some seemed eager for drama, while others appeared uncomfortable with the brewing conflict. A few of the actual veterans in the room watched with expressions of solidarity, understanding exactly what Marcus was feeling. Richardson broke the silence with a dismissive laugh, apparently deciding that intimidation was his best strategy. He made another disparaging comment about unemployed veterans, suggesting that their inability to find work was evidence of their inadequacy rather than systemic problems. The comment was clearly directed at Marcus, an attempt to humiliate him in front of the assembled crowd. Marcus remained calm, his military training helping him maintain composure even as anger burned in his chest. He had learned long ago that the most effective responses often came from quiet confidence rather than loud confrontation. The lessons of leadership that Richardson claimed veterans lacked were exactly what Marcus was preparing to demonstrate. The businessman seemed surprised by Marcus's lack of visible reaction to his taunts. Richardson had clearly expected anger or embarrassment, responses that would have confirmed his negative stereotypes about veterans. Instead, he faced a man who stood at attention without being rigid, alert without being aggressive, confident without being arrogant. As the silence stretched longer, Richardson apparently felt the need to reassert his dominance. He made one final, particularly cruel comment about veterans being society's rejects, people who joined the military because they could not succeed in the civilian world. It was the kind of statement designed to provoke a reaction, to goad Marcus into an outburst that would justify Richardson's prejudices. Instead, Marcus smiled slightly and reached into his jacket pocket. His movement was deliberate and unhurried, the action of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The room watched in fascination as he withdrew something small and metallic, holding it in his closed fist for a moment before speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. The phone call came the next morning while Marcus was packing his few belongings at the shelter. The voice belonged to James Mitchell, the CEO of Integrated Security Solutions, one of the business leaders who had witnessed the confrontation with Richardson the night before. Mitchell explained that he had been thinking about their brief conversation and wanted to discuss a position that had recently opened at his company. Unlike the previous interviews Marcus had endured, this conversation felt different from the very beginning. Mitchell spoke about his company's need for someone with real operational experience, someone who understood security challenges from the ground up, rather than from theoretical textbooks. He had been impressed not just by Marcus's military record, but by the dignity and professionalism he had displayed under pressure. The meeting took place at Mitchell's office, a modern building that housed one of the city's most successful security consulting firms. The company provided protective services for corporate executives, threat assessments for international businesses, and security consulting for government agencies. Their client list included Fortune 500 companies and federal departments, work that required the highest levels of competence and discretion. Mitchell was a former Marine himself, though he had left the service much earlier in his career to pursue business opportunities. He understood both the value of military experience and the challenges veterans faced in transitioning to civilian careers. His company had a track record of successfully integrating veteran employees, recognizing that their unique skills could provide competitive advantages in the security industry. The position Mitchell described was far more than Marcus had dared to hope for. As Director of Operations, he would oversee protective details, coordinate with law enforcement agencies, and develop security protocols for high-risk clients. The salary was substantial, the benefits comprehensive, and the work would allow him to use the skills he had developed during his military career in meaningful ways. During their conversation, Mitchell mentioned that he had known Richardson for years and had grown tired of the man's arrogance and prejudice. The previous evening had been the final straw, confirming his decision to end his company's business relationship with Richardson's firm. Several other business leaders had expressed similar sentiments, suggesting that Richardson's reputation in the community had been permanently damaged. Marcus accepted the position immediately, though the transition would take several weeks to complete the necessary security clearances and background checks. Mitchell arranged for him to receive an advance on his salary, enough to secure a decent apartment and purchase appropriate professional clothing. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he could plan for the future rather than simply surviving from day to day. The news spread quickly through the veteran community, both at the shelter and beyond. Marcus's confrontation with Richardson had become something of a legend, inspiring other veterans to speak up for themselves and demand the respect they deserved. Several employers who had witnessed the event reached out to veteran service organizations, expressing interest in hiring qualified former military personnel. Richardson's business suffered immediate consequences from his public humiliation. Several major clients canceled their contracts, citing concerns about working with someone who had demonstrated such poor judgment and character. His defense contracting company lost a significant government contract when word of his comments reached military procurement. Officials who took a dim view of contractors, who disparaged the troops they were supposed to support. The businessman attempted to control the damage through public apologies and donations to veteran organizations, but the sincerity of his efforts was questioned by many. Social media had picked up the story of the confrontation, with video footage from the charity dinner spreading rapidly online. Richardson became a cautionary tale about the consequences of prejudice and arrogance, his reputation serving as a reminder that disrespecting veterans could have serious professional ramifications. Marcus moved into his new apartment 3 weeks after starting his job, a one-bedroom place with actual furniture and a kitchen, where he could prepare his own meals. The contrast with his previous living situations was striking, but he tried not to dwell on the hardships he had endured. Instead, he focused on building a new life that honored both his military service and his civilian aspirations. His work at Integrated Security Solutions proved challenging and rewarding. In ways he had almost forgotten were possible, Marcus found himself working with law enforcement agencies, coordinating international security operations, and training younger employees who looked up to him as a mentor. The skills he had developed in the military were not just relevant but essential, validating everything he had tried to tell employers during his long job search. The company's other veteran employees welcomed Marcus as a brother, understanding the journey he had traveled to reach this point. They shared stories of their own struggles and triumphs, creating a support network that extended far beyond the workplace. Together, they worked to change perceptions about veteran capabilities, proving through their performance that military experience was an asset rather than a liability. 6 months after the charity dinner confrontation, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was from a young veteran who had heard about his story through social media and veteran networks. The soldier was struggling with his own job search and facing many of the same challenges Marcus had overcome. He wanted advice and encouragement from someone who had successfully navigated the transition from military to civilian career. Marcus spent an evening crafting his response, sharing not just practical advice about job searching, but also the importance of maintaining dignity and self-respect during difficult times. He encouraged the young veteran to remember that his service had value, that his skills were needed, and that persistence would eventually lead to the right opportunity. The letter became the first of many that Marcus would write to struggling veterans over the coming months. Word spread through military networks about his willingness to help, and soon he was fielding calls and emails from former service members across the country. Each conversation reminded him of his own dark days and reinforced his commitment to ensuring that other veterans did not face their challenges alone. Marcus began speaking at veteran events and job fairs, sharing his story not as a tale of personal triumph, but as evidence that the system could work when veterans stood up for themselves and demanded fair treatment. His message was simple but powerful. Military service was an asset, not a burden, and veterans deserved respect for their sacrifices rather than discrimination based on outdated stereotypes. The challenge coin that had started everything remained on Marcus's desk at work, a constant reminder of the moment when his life had changed direction. Colleagues often asked about its significance, and Marcus would tell them about the confrontation with Richardson, always emphasizing that the real victory had not been humiliating. One ignorant businessman, but rather opening doors for countless other veterans who deserved better treatment. Richardson's company eventually went out of business, unable to recover from the loss of clients and reputation that followed the charity dinner incident. The businessman himself faded from public view, his name becoming synonymous with the kind of prejudice and arrogance that the business community increasingly rejected. His downfall served as a warning to others who might be tempted to dismiss or disrespect those who had served their country. Mitchell's company, meanwhile, thrived with its veteran-heavy workforce. The unique perspectives and skills that former military personnel brought to the table gave them competitive advantages that their rivals struggled to match. Client satisfaction increased, employee retention improved, and the company's reputation for excellence grew stronger each year. Other businesses began actively recruiting veterans, recognizing the value that Marcus and his colleagues had demonstrated. A year after the confrontation, Marcus was promoted to senior director, overseeing multiple divisions within the company. His success was measured not just in profit margins and client satisfaction, but in the number of veteran employees he had hired and mentored. Each new hire represented another life transformed, another person given the opportunity to rebuild their civilian career with dignity and tact. The veteran shelter where Marcus had once stayed became one of his company's regular recruitment sources. He would visit monthly, not as a former resident but as a successful executive looking for talent among men and women who were going through their own difficult transitions. The shelter's success rate for job placement improved dramatically, as Marcus and other veteran business leaders provided real opportunities rather than empty promises. Marcus never forgot the lessons of his homeless period, the humiliation of rejection, or the desperation of facing an uncertain future. These experiences made him a better leader and a more compassionate person, someone who understood that success was meaningless unless it was shared with those still struggling to find their place in the civilian world. On quiet evenings in his apartment, Marcus would sometimes hold the challenge coin and remember his service had value, that his skills were needed, and that persistence would eventually lead to the right opportunity. The letter became the first of many that Marcus would write to struggling veterans over the coming months. Word spread through military networks about his willingness to help, and soon he was fielding calls and emails from former service members across the country. Each conversation reminded him of his own dark days and reinforced his commitment to ensuring that other veterans did not face their challenges alone. Marcus began speaking at veteran events and job fairs, sharing his story not as a tale of personal triumph, but as evidence that the system could work when veterans stood up for themselves and demanded fair treatment. His message was simple but powerful. Military service was an asset, not a burden, and veterans deserved respect for their sacrifices rather than discrimination based on outdated stereotypes. The challenge coin that had started everything remained on Marcus's desk at work, a constant reminder of the moment when his life had changed direction. Colleagues often asked about its significance, and Marcus would tell them about the confrontation with Richardson, always emphasizing that the real victory had not been humiliating one ignorant businessman, but rather opening doors for countless other veterans who deserved better treatment. Richardson's company eventually went out of business, unable to recover from the loss of clients and reputation that followed the charity dinner incident. The businessman himself faded from public view, his name becoming synonymous with the kind of prejudice and arrogance that the business community increasingly rejected. His downfall served as a warning to others who might be tempted to dismiss or disrespect those who had served their country. Mitchell's company, meanwhile, thrived with its veteran-heavy workforce. The unique perspectives and skills that former military personnel brought to the table gave them competitive advantages that their rivals struggled to match. Client satisfaction increased, employee retention improved, and the company's reputation for excellence grew stronger each year. Other businesses began actively recruiting veterans, recognizing the value that Marcus and his colleagues had demonstrated. A year after the confrontation, Marcus was promoted to senior director, overseeing multiple divisions within the company. His success was measured not just in profit margins and client satisfaction, but in the number of veteran employees he had hired and mentored. Each new hire represented another life transformed, another person given the opportunity to rebuild their civilian career with dignity intact. The veteran shelter where Marcus had once stayed became one of his company's regular recruitment sources. He would visit monthly, not as a former resident but as a successful executive looking for talent among men and women who were going through their own difficult transitions. The shelter's success rate for job placement improved dramatically as Marcus and other veteran business leaders provided real opportunities rather than empty promises. Marcus never forgot the lessons of his homeless period, the humiliation of rejection, or the desperation of facing an uncertain future. These experiences made him a better leader and a more compassionate person, someone who understood that success was meaningless unless it was shared with those still struggling to find their place in the civilian world. On quiet evenings in his apartment, Marcus would sometimes hold the challenge coin and remember the moment when everything changed. Two simple words, Hawk 8, had transformed not just his own life but the lives of countless other veterans who found new hope in his example. The coin represented more than military service. It symbolized the power of standing up for oneself and others, the importance of dignity in the face of adversity, and the truth that real strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The story of Marcus Thompson and his confrontation with the arrogant businessman became part of veteran folklore, passed down through military networks as an example of what could happen when someone finally said enough. But for Marcus himself, the real victory was not in the moment of confrontation, but in the years that followed, when his success opened doors for others and proved that veterans were not broken soldiers, but valuable assets waiting for the right opportunity to serve their country once again.